The wind, a relentless sculptor of the high plains, carried the scent of dust and distant rain, a scent Ilara knew as intimately as the metallic tang of cooling iron. It swept through the fledgling town of Redemption, a place that clung precariously to the edge of a vast, indifferent wilderness, rattling the ill-fitted windows of the smithy that was both her home and her world. Inside, the rhythmic clang of her father's hammer against stubborn steel was the town's heartbeat, a sound of creation and repair in a land that seemed more inclined to break things. Ilara, her hands calloused and strong, worked the bellows, her gaze fixed on the glowing heart of the forge, a miniature sun against the encroaching twilight. She was a creature of fire and effort, her solace found in the transformation of raw material into purpose. It was this purpose, this inherited skill, that Silas Blackwood, with his town-bought suits and an air of owning everything he surveyed, failed to comprehend. He saw only a comely woman, an asset to be acquired, a pretty flower to be plucked from the soot and transplanted into the sterile soil of his burgeoning, ill-gotten prosperity. His visits had become more frequent, his proposals less veiled, laden with the cloying sweetness of false promise. He spoke of silks and ease, of a life removed from the grime and toil, a life she felt would suffocate her faster than any lungful of forge smoke. Her father, Thomas, a man whose words were as carefully weighed as his hammer blows, watched these encounters with a quiet apprehension, trusting his daughter's judgment yet knowing the precariousness of their position. Silas owned the land on which too many livelihoods depended, his displeasure was a cold wind that could chill the warmest hearth. Today, Silas had cornered her as she drew water from the well, his shadow falling long and possessive across the dusty ground. "Ilara," he'd purred, his voice like oil on water, "my offer still stands. A woman of your attributes should not be squandering her youth in soot and cinders." He gestured vaguely towards the smithy, a flicker of distaste in his eyes. "This town is growing. I am its future. Be part of it, with me." His hand reached for hers, soft and manicured, a stark contrast to her own. She pulled back, not sharply, but with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice low but clear, carrying over the whisper of the ever-present wind, "I thank you for your consideration. But my place is here, with my father, and with the work I understand." She met his gaze directly, her own reflecting the steady glow of the forge fires she tended. "I have no desire for the life you offer." His smile, usually so confident, tightened. A brief, almost imperceptible flicker of something cold and hard sparked in his eyes before being quickly veiled. "A pity," he said, his tone losing its silken edge, becoming flat, almost brittle. "A great pity. Some things, once offered and refused, cannot be offered again. And some choices have consequences that last longer than a season." He turned then, a little too abruptly, his polished boots kicking up small puffs of dust, and strode back towards the more salubrious end of Redemption, where his newly built emporium stood as a monument to his ambition. Ilara watched him go, a shiver tracing its way down her spine despite the day's residual heat. His words, vague as they were, settled in the pit of her stomach like a cold stone. The wind picked up, whistling a mournful tune around the corners of the smithy, and the scent of rain grew stronger, though the sky remained stubbornly, ominously clear. That night, the familiar sounds of the town settling, a distant dog barking, the murmur of voices from the saloon, the creak of her father's cot in the room beside hers, were subtly altered by an undercurrent of unease she couldn't shake. She lay awake, listening, the heat of the forge long since faded from her skin, replaced by a chill that had little to do with the night air. The first insidious crackle, like dry leaves underfoot, barely registered through the thick veil of Ilara's exhausted slumber. Then came the scent, acrid and alien in the familiar confines of their small living quarters adjoining the smithy. Smoke. Thick, choking, not the honest smoke of the forge, but the greedy, devouring breath of uncontrolled flame. Her eyes snapped open to an infernal, orange glow dancing mockingly on the rough-hewn walls. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the remnants of sleep. "Father!" The cry tore from her throat, raw and desperate. She scrambled from her cot, the floorboards already hot beneath her bare feet. The air was a searing blanket, stealing her breath, each inhale a mouthful of stinging cinders. Through the haze, she saw the doorway to her father's small room, silhouetted against a terrifyingly bright, flickering light that pulsed from the smithy beyond. The roar was growing, a hungry beast consuming their world. She stumbled towards his door, shouting his name again and again, her voice cracking. He emerged, coughing, his face pale and etched with disbelief in the hellish light, his nightshirt already smudged with soot. Ilara! The smithy, it's... He didn't need to finish. The heart of their lives, the source of their sustenance and pride, was being eaten alive. We have to get out, she gasped, grabbing his arm, pulling him towards the small back door, the one that led to the scraggly patch of ground behind their building. The main entrance, through the smithy itself, was an impassable inferno. The heat was a physical blow, pressing against them, sucking the moisture from their eyes, their mouths. Sparks, like malevolent fireflies, danced around them, settling on their clothes, their hair. Ilara barely registered the sting of a cinder landing on her cheek. Her only thought was escape, her father's safety paramount. They burst out into the night air, which, though cool, was thick with the stench of their burning life. They stumbled a short distance away, turning to look back at the horror. The smithy was a raging pyre, flames leaping high into the dark sky, consuming the heavy timbers of the roof, the sturdy walls that had housed generations of her family's craft. The bellows, the anvil, the myriad tools her father cherished, each one an extension of his own hands, were being tortured and destroyed within that terrible crucible. A strangled sound escaped Thomas's lips, a sound of such profound desolation that it knifed through Ilara's own terror, leaving her hollow. He reached out a trembling hand, as if to ward off the destruction, or perhaps to reclaim something, anything, from the blaze. Neighbors were appearing now, drawn by the light and the roar, their faces illuminated by the ghastly spectacle, etched with shock and a dawning fear. Some shouted, others stood in stunned silence. A few made tentative, futile efforts with buckets of water, pitiful offerings against the inferno's might. Ilara knew, with a dreadful certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was no accident. The speed of it, the ferocity, it spoke of intent. Silas Blackwood's veiled threat echoed in her mind, no longer vague, but a pronouncement of brutal execution. Asterisk consequences that last longer than a season. Asterisk he had meant this. This devastation. This utter, annihilating loss. She sank to her knees, the rough ground biting into her skin, her gaze fixed on the collapsing structure. The tools of their trade, the legacy of her grandfather, the sweat and dreams of her father, her own burgeoning skills, all turning to ash and twisted, glowing metal. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the soot, carving clean pathways through the grime. Despair, vast and suffocating, threatened to drown her. Everything was gone. Their home, their livelihood, their past, their future. The wind, which had earlier seemed a mournful companion, now seemed to whip the flames higher, a malevolent accomplice in their ruin. The town of redemption, so named for a hope that now felt like a cruel mockery, stood by and watched them burn. Dawn broke grey and indifferent, the rising sun illuminating a scene of utter devastation. Where the sturdy smithy and their small, attached home had stood, there was now only a smoking, blackened ruin. Twisted skeletons of metal, once tools of creation, lay amidst charred timbers and piles of ash that steamed in the cool morning air. The fierce heat of the blaze had given way to a penetrating, damp chill. Ilara, wrapped in a thin, borrowed blanket, shivered, though not entirely from the cold. Her father sat on an overturned crate, salvaged by a braver neighbor, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the smoldering remains. The vibrant energy that usually animated him, the quiet strength that flowed from his hands into the metal he shaped, was extinguished, leaving behind a fragile, hollowed-out old man. His silence was more profound than any lament. The townsfolk, those who had gathered in the night, mostly kept their distance now. A few offered hushed condolences, their eyes darting nervously towards the street, as if expecting Silas Blackwood to materialize and punish them for their sympathy. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, a woman whose kindness was as reliable as her morning bread, brought them a small loaf and a flask of weak tea, her face etched with pity and a helpless anger. "Terrible, child, terrible," she murmured, pressing Ilara's hand. "If there's anything but Silas." She trailed off, the unspoken fear hanging heavy in the air. Silas. His name was a venomous whisper that seemed to cling to the lingering smoke. He made his appearance mid-morning, strolling down the dusty street with an air of casual concern that was utterly obscene. He paused at a safe distance from the ruin, his gaze sweeping over it, then settling on Elara and her father. There was no smirk, no overt sign of triumph, just a cool, appraising look that made Elara's blood run cold. It was the look of a man who had swatted an irritating fly and was now observing the results with detached satisfaction. A tragedy, he declared, his voice carrying easily in the quiet morning. A terrible accident. One must be so careful with fire, especially in these dry conditions. He tutted softly. If there's anything I can do to assist, Thomas. Elara. The offer was a poisoned dart, meant to inflict further pain. Elara felt a surge of bile rise in her throat. She wanted to scream, to accuse him, to tear that mask of false sympathy from his face. But she met his gaze, held it, and let her own eyes, raw and red-rimmed but steady, convey the silent accusation, the knowledge of his guilt. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a flicker of something unreadable in his own, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a message received, and continued on his way, his polished boots untroubled by the ashes of their life. The interaction, brief as it was, seemed to drain the last vestiges of neighborly courage from the few who lingered. They melted away, back to their own routines, their own anxieties, leaving Elara and Thomas alone with their desolation. The isolation was a palpable thing, a shroud as suffocating as the smoke had been. They had served this town, mended its tools, shod its horses, contributed to its fragile growth. Now, in their hour of greatest need, the town offered only averted gazes and fearful whispers. Elara began to sift through the debris, a desperate, futile hope that something, anything, might be salvageable. Her hands, bare and already scratched, moved through the still warm ashes. She found a twisted horseshoe, a melted ladle, the warped head of a hammer, her father's favorite, its handle consumed by the flames. Each ruined object was a fresh stab of grief. Her anger, a nascent thing born in the firelight, began to smolder within her, a counterpoint to the chilling despair. It was a small, hard ember of defiance in the vast emptiness of her loss. They were beaten, yes, but she would not let them be entirely broken. The town might abandon them, Silas might gloat, but she would find a way. She had to. For her father, whose spirit seemed to have fled with the rising smoke, and for herself, because the alternative was to let the ashes consume her too. The days that followed were a blur of cold reality and colder shoulders. They found temporary, grudging shelter in a dilapidated, abandoned shed on the very outskirts of Redemption, a place more accustomed to housing stray animals than people. Its roof leaked, and the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, a constant, mournful sigh. Thomas rarely spoke, spending his hours staring into the distance, his calloused hands, now idle, resting heavily in his lap. Elara, driven by a desperate necessity, scavenged. She returned to the ruins of the smithy each day, meticulously sifting through the ashes, her efforts yielding little more than a few pieces of scorched metal, misshapen and scarred, but perhaps, just perhaps, reworkable if they ever found a forge again. The townsfolk continued their passive ostracism. Supplies, when she could afford them with the few coins Mrs. Henderson had pressed into her hand, were sold with a reluctant haste, conversations kept to a minimum. Their plight was an uncomfortable mirror, reflecting the town's fear and impotence in the face of Silas Blackwood's quiet tyranny. It was during one of her solitary foraging trips, venturing further than usual along the creek bed where debris sometimes washed down from further upstream, that Elara first felt it, the distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched. There was no sound, no rustle of leaves beyond what the wind created, no glint of an eye in the dense thicket that lined the far bank. Yet, the feeling was undeniable, a prickling on her skin, an ancient instinct alerting her to an unseen presence. She straightened slowly, her heart thudding, and scanned the trees, the shadowed undergrowth. Nothing. Just the whisper of the wind through the cottonwoods and the murmur of the shallow water over stones. She told herself it was her frayed nerves, the lingering trauma of the fire, the constant anxiety of their precarious existence. Yet, the feeling persisted, not overtly threatening, but undeniably there, a steady, silent observation. A few days later, returning to their wretched shed after a fruitless search for edible roots, she found a small, neatly bundled collection of dried rabbit jerky and a handful of hardy winter berries placed just inside the doorway, on a clean, flat stone. Her father hadn't moved from his rough pallet. No one from the town would have dared such a kindness, especially not in secret. She picked up the offering, her mind racing. The jerky was expertly prepared, the berries unfamiliar but clearly chosen with knowledge. It couldn't be Silas, this was sustenance, not mockery. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger this time, as if the giver were nearby, assessing her reaction. She looked around, a cautious hello, dying on her lips. Only the vast, indifferent landscape answered, stretching out under a sky the color of faded denim. The townspeople spoke of the Apache, their words usually laced with fear and misunderstanding. They were the wild ones, the savages, figures of myth and dread who lived in the hills and canyons beyond redemption's tentative reach. Ilara had absorbed these stories, these ingrained prejudices, without much thought. Now, a different possibility began to form, a hesitant question in her mind. Could it be them? The thought was both unsettling and, strangely, a little less terrifying than the known malice of Silas Blackwood. The environment itself seemed to reflect her inner turmoil. The plains were stark, unforgiving, the beauty harsh and demanding. Yet, within that harshness, there was an undeniable vitality, a resilience that mirrored the flicker of hope she was trying to nurture within herself. This land, which had witnessed her ruin, also held secrets, and perhaps, unexpected eyes that saw more than the cowering townsfolk dared to acknowledge. The small offering of food was a puzzle, a fragile thread of an unknown narrative beginning to weave itself into the stark tapestry of her despair. The encounters, if they could be called such, remained shrouded in an unnerving subtlety for a time. More than once, Ilara would return to their crude shelter to find a small offering, a few surprisingly fresh bird eggs nestled in a bed of dry grass, a brace of plump quail, even a tightly woven, waterproof reed mat that proved a godsend against the leaking roof. Each discovery was accompanied by that same prickling awareness of unseen eyes, a silent, assessing presence that lingered just beyond the edge of her perception. Her fear, initially sharp and instinctive, began to dull, replaced by a hesitant curiosity and a dawning, almost reluctant sense of gratitude. These gifts were not random acts of nature, they were deliberate, knowledgeable, and vital to their survival. Her father, roused slightly from his apathy by these small, inexplicable boons, would examine them with a flicker of his old practicality. Good quality, he might murmur, running a thumb over a perfectly cured strip of venison. Whoever left this knows their way around game. He never speculated further, but Ilara saw a new watchfulness in his eyes when he looked towards the distant, brooding hills. One afternoon, Ilara ventured further than ever before, driven by a desperate need to find something, anything, that could be bartered for a little lamp oil or a handful of salt. She followed a faint game trail that wound its way up a low rise, overlooking a shallow, wooded canyon. She was crouched, examining some unfamiliar herbs, when a shadow fell over her. Not the diffuse shadow of a cloud, but the distinct, sharp outline of a man. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, heart hammering against her ribs, she rose, turning to face the source. 3 men stood there, silent as the stones around them. They were Apache, their features striking and severe, their dark eyes holding an unnerving stillness. They wore simple buckskin, carried unadorned boughs, and moved with a fluid grace that made them seem part of the landscape itself. One, slightly taller than the others, with a gaze that seemed to penetrate to her very core, stood a little forward. This must be Cale, she thought, though no name had been given, no introduction made. This was the presence she had felt. Fear, cold and immediate, washed over her, the ingrained tales of the townspeople screaming a warning in her mind. She expected hostility, a threat, perhaps worse. But they merely looked at her, their expressions unreadable, their stillness more unnerving than any overt aggression. The taller one, Cale, tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. It was not a threatening look, but one of profound, almost unnerving, observation. He saw her ragged clothes, the smudges of old soot on her face that soap and scarce water couldn't entirely erase, the desperation she tried so hard to hide. He saw, she felt with a startling certainty, everything. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the sigh of the wind in the sparse pines and the frantic beating of her own heart. Ilara found she could not look away from Cale's eyes. There was no malice there, but an ancient wisdom, a deep understanding of hardship, and something else, a quiet strength that resonated with a hidden chord within her. Then, Cale made a subtle gesture with his hand, a slight turn of his wrist, indicating a narrow, almost invisible path leading down into the canyon. He said nothing. His companions remained equally silent, their dark eyes missing nothing. Ilara hesitated, torn between her fear and an inexplicable pull. The path he indicated was not one she would have found on her own. After another long moment, Cale took a single step back, a silent invitation, or perhaps simply a yielding of the space. Ilara, her throat dry, gave a tiny, jerky nod, a wordless acknowledgement. She didn't understand what was happening, why they were here, why they hadn't harmed her. She only knew that this encounter felt less dangerous than any conversation with Silas Blackwood. With a deep breath, she turned and slowly, cautiously, began to make her way towards the indicated path. She did not look back, but she could feel their eyes on her until she disappeared into the trees. The path led to a small, clear spring she hadn't known existed, and nearby, a patch of wild berries, ripe and plentiful. It was a lifeline, freely given, without expectation. The fear had not entirely vanished, but it was now overlaid with a profound sense of bewilderment and a fragile, nascent trust in something she couldn't yet name. The silent offerings continued, more direct now, as if the encounter on the rise had subtly altered the terms of their strange, unspoken relationship. A sturdy, well-tanned deer hide appeared one morning, draped over the crumbling wall of their shed, a vast improvement on the leaky reed mat. Another day, a collection of medicinal herbs, carefully bundled, lay beside their water bucket. Ilara recognized some from her mother's old remedies, potent against coughs and fevers, a timely gift as her father's chest had begun to rattle with a persistent, dry hack. Cale, she had decided to call the leader in her mind, for he carried an air of quiet authority that his companions deferred to. She never saw him, or any of them, deliver these gifts. They materialized as if by the land's own volition, yet bore the unmistakable mark of human skill and intention. The fear that had once defined her encounters with the unseen watchers had largely given way to a complex mix of gratitude and a deep, unsettling curiosity. These were not the savages of redemption's fearful imagination. Their actions spoke of a different code, one of observation, discernment, and a stark, practical form of compassion that asked for nothing in return. Ilara's internal world was shifting. The certainty of Silas Blackwood's guilt for the fire had solidified from a desperate suspicion into an undeniable conviction. She saw his smug composure in town, the way he moved with the unchallenged arrogance of a man who believed himself above all consequence. The contrast between his polished cruelty and the quiet, almost invisible aid from the Apache was a chasm. One represented the worst of her own kind, greed, malice, the abuse of power. The others, so long feared and maligned, were demonstrating a kind of honor that redemption, in its cowering silence, seemed to have forgotten. Her father, too, was slowly changing. The herbs eased his cough, the regular supply of fresh game brought a little strength back to his limbs. He began to mend the deer hide with a salvaged awl and some sinew Ilara had found, his hands, though stiff, remembering their old cunning. He spoke little of the source of their aid, but once, watching Ilara patch her worn dress with a surprisingly fine needle she'd found tucked into a gift of dried fruit, he murmured, "They see. They know who is a threat, and who is just trying to live." It was the closest he came to acknowledging the Apache, a quiet statement of understanding that transcended the town's prejudice. Ilara continued her forays, driven now not just by need but by a faint, unacknowledged hope of another encounter, a chance to understand. She began to notice things she hadn't before, a subtly broken twig indicating a path, the almost invisible print of a moccasin in the dust, the distant call of a bird that seemed, somehow, like a signal. The land was no longer just a harsh backdrop to her suffering, it was alive with a hidden language, a subtle network of signs and meanings. The trust she was building was not the easy camaraderie of townsfolk, but something far deeper and more elemental, an understanding forged in shared space, in observed hardship, and in the profound silence of mutual, if distant, respect. The smithy's ruin still dominated her nightmares, but now, sometimes, images of the still, watchful eyes of Cale would intercede, not as a threat, but as a steady, enigmatic presence in the vast, wild landscape that had become both her prison and her unlikely sanctuary. The embers of her anger toward Silas still burned, but they were now banked, controlled, waiting for a wind that might, one day, fan them into a flame of justice. Silas Blackwood was not accustomed to being ignored, nor was he tolerant of loose ends. The continued presence of Ilara and her father, however wretched their circumstances, on the edge of his town, began to grate on his sense of order and control. He had expected them to be broken entirely, to crawl away in defeat, or perhaps to come begging for his mercy, a scenario he would have savored. Their quiet endurance, their refusal to simply vanish, was an affront. Rumors, faint and distorted, might have even reached him of the strange, small ways they managed to survive, whispers that perhaps old Thomas still had some fight, or that Ilara possessed an unnatural resilience. He began to make his displeasure known in subtle ways. The storekeeper who had grudgingly sold Ilara supplies suddenly found his own deliveries from the east delayed, his credit questioned. The one or two families who had offered furtive scraps of charity found themselves subject to Blackwood's cold scrutiny, their small debt suddenly called due. The message was clear: association with the ruined blacksmith and his daughter was ill-advised. One blustery afternoon, as Ilara was returning from the creek with a meager catch of 2 small fish, Silas intercepted her. He rode his fine black gelding, positioning himself directly in her path, forcing her to halt. His men, a pair of rough-looking sycophants he kept on his payroll, flanked him at a slight distance. "Ilara," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier false charm, now flat and hard. "Still here, I see. Some vermin are harder to eradicate than others." His eyes flicked contemptuously over her patched dress, the makeshift fishing spear in her hand. Ilara stood her ground, her heart pounding, but her gaze was steady. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but something else had taken root within her over the past weeks, a quiet steel, forged in loss and tempered by the unexpected, silent support from the wilderness. "This is my home, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice low but clear. "Or what's left of it. We have as much right to be here as any." His lips curled into a sneer. "Rights? Rights are for those who can afford them, girl. You and your father are an eyesore, a blight. Perhaps it's time you moved on. Far away. Before another, unfortunate accident, befalls you." The threat was blatant now, stripped of all pretense. Just then, from the dense willows that lined the creek bank a little way off, a figure emerged. It was Cale. He moved with that unnerving silence, simply appearing, as if the land itself had produced him. He was alone, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on Silas Blackwood. 2 more Apache warriors materialized a moment later, taking up position slightly behind him, equally silent, equally watchful. Silas, startled, turned in his saddle. His men tensed, their hands moving towards the pistols at their belts. "What is this?" Silas demanded, his voice losing some of its confident bluster. "Stay out of this, savage. This is town business." Cale did not react to the slur. His gaze remained fixed on Blackwood, calm, unwavering. He spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying with a resonant authority that cut through the wind. The fire that consumed their home, it left scars on the land. The smoke choked the air for many days. Such acts have echoes. His English was precise, accented, but perfectly clear. Silas scoffed, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. "Are you accusing me of something, boy? You have no proof." "It was an accident." Cale's gaze didn't waver. "Proof is carried on the wind, in the ashes. Some truths do not need a town crier." He then turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Ilara's for a brief, significant moment. It was not a promise of intervention, not yet, but an acknowledgement. He saw. He understood. Silas, regaining some of his arrogance, spurred his horse a step closer to Cale. "This is my town. My land. You and your kind have no say here. Be warned. Meddle in my affairs, and you will regret it." Cale simply looked at him, a stillness about him that was more potent than any shouted threat. "This land," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every word distinct, "does not belong to one man's greed. It remembers all debts." With that, he gave a subtle inclination of his head, and as silently as they had appeared, he and his companions melted back into the willows, vanishing from sight. Silas stared after them, his face flushed with anger and a new, unwelcome apprehension. He turned back to Alara, his eyes narrowed. "You'll pay for this, girl. For consorting with them." But his threat lacked its earlier conviction. The unexpected appearance of the Apache, their quiet, implacable presence, had introduced a new, unpredictable element into his carefully controlled world. Alara watched him ride off, his men trailing uneasily behind. Her fear was still present, but now it was mingled with a surge of something fierce and almost triumphant. The truth had been spoken, not by her, but for her. And Silas Blackwood, for the first time, looked like a man who understood he might not be entirely untouchable. Silas Blackwood was not a man to be easily deterred, particularly when his authority was challenged. The silent, knowing presence of the Apache, coupled with Alara's resilient defiance, festered within him like a wound. He saw their continued survival not merely as an inconvenience, but as a direct insult, a mockery of his power. His solution, as always, was rooted in brutality and the arrogant assumption that force could solve any problem. He gathered his most thuggish enforcers, men whose loyalty was bought with coin and whose morality was as barren as the winter plains. His instructions were simple: drive the blacksmith and his daughter out, burn whatever miserable shelter they had, and ensure they understood, finally and irrevocably, that redemption was his domain. If the savages interfered, they were to be dealt with accordingly. He underestimated the Apache's intelligence network, the way the whispers of the land carried news to those who knew how to listen. Cale and his warriors were aware of Blackwood's simmering rage, the tightening coil of his malice. They had seen his men gathering, their purpose thinly veiled by drunken boasts in the town saloon. The attack came under the cloak of a moonless night, a darkness that Blackwood believed would hide his villainy. His men, emboldened by whiskey and the promise of payment, descended upon the dilapidated shed with torches and clubs. Alara and her father were jolted awake by the splintering crash of their flimsy door being kicked in. "Out, old man!" "And you, girl," a rough voice snarled. "Blackwood's had enough of your squalor." Torches cast grotesque, dancing shadows, illuminating the brutal faces of their assailants. Fear, stark and primal, gripped Alara, but this time, it was different. It was not the paralyzing despair of the first fire. This time, there was a cold, hard fury mixed with it. She grabbed the only weapon she had, a heavy iron poker, salvaged from the ruins of the smithy, its tip crudely sharpened. Her father, frail but resolute, stood beside her, a length of fire-hardened wood in his trembling hands. "Leave us be!" Thomas cried, his voice thin but defiant. "We've done you no harm." One of the men laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "Orders are orders, old-timer." He advanced, club raised. But before he could strike, an arrow hissed out of the darkness, thudding into the wooden doorframe inches from his head. He yelped, stumbling back. Another arrow struck the torch from another man's hand, plunging their immediate vicinity into deeper shadow, lit only by the remaining flickering brands. Blackwood's men froze, their bravado instantly evaporating. Apache, one of them choked out, his voice tight with terror. From the surrounding darkness, figures emerged, silent, swift, and utterly deadly. It was not a chaotic charge, but a precise, coordinated movement. Cale was at the forefront, his expression grim, his movements economical and powerful. The fight was brutal but mercifully short. The Apache warriors moved with a terrifying efficiency, disarming Blackwood's thugs, their skill with bow, knife, and hand-to-hand combat far superior to the clumsy aggression of their opponents. They used the shadows, the terrain, their knowledge of the night, turning the attackers' surprise into their own advantage. Ilara, clutching her poker, found herself strangely calm amidst the chaos. She saw an opening, one of Blackwood's men momentarily undefended as he grappled with an Apache warrior. With a cry born of months of suppressed grief and anger, she lunged, thrusting the poker's sharpened end into the man's thigh. He screamed, collapsing, clutching his leg. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was hers, an act of defiance, of self-preservation. Cale, in a blur of motion, subdued the last of Blackwood's men. Silas himself, who had been lurking at a supposed safe distance, observing what he assumed would be a swift victory, suddenly found Cale standing before him. The rich man's face was a mask of disbelief and terror. This is an outrage," Silas stammered, fumbling for the fancy pistol at his belt. Cale's hand shot out, faster than thought, clamping onto Silas's wrist. The pistol clattered to the ground. "Your reign of shadows ends, Blackwood," Cale said, his voice low and cold. "The land has judged you." There was no grand pronouncement of justice, no lengthy speech. The Apache warriors bound Silas and his remaining conscious men securely. Their efficiency was chilling, their purpose clear. The threat was neutralized, not through indiscriminate slaughter, but through decisive, controlled action. As the sounds of struggle died away, replaced by the whimpers of the defeated thugs and the heavy breathing of the combatants, Ilara lowered her poker. Her arm trembled, not from fear, but from the adrenaline, the release of pent-up fury. She looked at Cale, who met her gaze across the small, dark space. His face was still grim, but in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something akin to approval, a warrior's acknowledgement of her own courage. The night air, still carrying the scent of fear and violence, also held the first faint promise of a dawn free from Silas Blackwood's shadow. The immediate aftermath was a strange tableau of stark contrasts, the bound and groaning forms of Silas Blackwood's men, nursing their wounds and their shattered arrogance, the silent, watchful Apache warriors, their expressions unreadable as they efficiently secured the area, and Ilara and her father, standing amidst the debris of their crude shelter, shaken but unharmed. The moon, finally breaking through the cloud cover, cast a pale, ethereal light on the scene, lending it an almost dreamlike quality. Cale approached Ilara and Thomas. He paused a respectful distance away, his dark eyes assessing them for injury. "You are safe now," he stated, his voice calm, a stark contrast to the recent violence. Thomas, leaning heavily on his makeshift staff, nodded slowly. "We owe you more than we can say." His voice was thick with emotion. Ilara found her own words caught in her throat. The gratitude she felt was immense, overwhelming, too profound for simple thanks. She could only meet Cale's gaze, hoping her eyes conveyed what her voice could not. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement that transcended words. The Apache did not linger. Their purpose accomplished, they prepared to depart. One of them, an older warrior with eyes that held the wisdom of many seasons, approached Thomas and offered him a water skin. Another quietly began to right the overturned table and salvaged stool within the damaged shed, small acts of restoration in the wake of chaos. Cale spoke briefly with his men in their own tongue, then turned back to Ilara. "Blackwood will trouble you no more. He will be taken far from here, where his greed cannot poison the land or its people." He did not elaborate on Silas's fate, and Ilara did not ask. It was enough. As the warriors began to melt back into the darkness from which they had come, Cale paused. He looked at the crude poker still clutched in Ilara's hand, then at her face, smudged with dirt and illuminated by the moonlight. A very faint, almost indiscernible softening touched the corners of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "You have the heart of a fighter, Ilara, daughter of the smith," he said, his use of her name, and her heritage, a quiet affirmation. "Do not let the fire be the only thing that shapes you." With that, he too turned and disappeared into the night, as silent and enigmatic as ever. Ilara watched him go, a profound sense of change settling within her. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was finally receding, replaced by a weary but hopeful calm. She looked at her father, who was watching her, a new light in his eyes. The stooped, broken man he had become after the fire was slowly being replaced by a flicker of his old self, his resilience rekindled by this unexpected deliverance. They were not alone. Help had come from the most unexpected quarter, from a people her society had demonized and feared. She reflected on the nature of prejudice, how easily it blinded, how readily it judged, and how true character, true honor, often resided where it was least expected. The smithy was still a ruin, their possessions few, their future uncertain. But the oppressive weight of Silas Blackwood's malice was lifted. In its place was a new, fragile foundation, one built not on the structures of the town, but on the resilience of the human spirit and the surprising bonds of an unspoken alliance. The night, which had begun with terror, ended with a quiet sense of peace, the silence of the plains no longer feeling threatening, but protective, watchful, imbued with the spirit of those who understood its deepest rhythms. Ilara knew she had been irrevocably altered, not just by loss, but by courage, her own, and that of the silent warriors who had stepped from the shadows to restore a fragile balance. Dawn arrived, painting the eastern sky in hues of rose and pale gold, a gentle contrast to the harsh events of the night. Ilara and her father emerged from their battered shed into a world that felt subtly, yet profoundly, different. The air itself seemed cleaner, lighter, no longer thick with the unspoken menace of Silas Blackwood. The immediate, pressing fear was gone, leaving in its wake a vast, quiet space for rebuilding, both externally and within. The Apache were gone, leaving no trace of their presence save for the bound ropes that Silas's men had eventually wriggled out of before fleeing back to the dubious sanctuary of redemption, no doubt to spread wild tales of their encounter. Silas himself was truly gone, spirited away into the vastness of the wilderness. Ilara found a new, sharper-edged adze and a small, sturdy hunting knife left discreetly by the shed door, tools of survival, tools for a new beginning. They were not gifts of charity, but offerings of respect, tools that acknowledged her inherent capacity to endure and rebuild. Her father, Thomas, seemed to have shed years overnight. The dull apathy that had clung to him since the fire was replaced by a quiet purpose. He examined the adze with a craftsman's eye, his fingers tracing its keen edge. "Good steel," he murmured, a ghost of his old smith's appreciation in his voice. "They know their work." Together, they began the slow, arduous task of repair. The shed, though still humble, became a focal point of their efforts. They patched the holes, reinforced the walls, their movements synchronized by a renewed sense of shared purpose. Ilara thought of Cale's parting words, "Do not let the fire be the only thing that shapes you." The fire had indeed shaped her, it had burned away her naivety, her dependence, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. But it was not the only forge. The quiet strength of the Apache, their unexpected justice, her own desperate courage, these two were shaping her, molding her into someone new, someone stronger. She was no longer merely the blacksmith's daughter, a victim of circumstance. She was Ilara, a survivor, a woman who had looked into the face of ruin and refused to be consumed. Her transformation was not loud or dramatic, but a quiet unfolding, like a desert flower blooming after a rare rain. She carried herself with a new stillness, a watchfulness learned from Cale and his people. Her hands, though still calloused from labor, moved with a newfound confidence. The landscape itself, once a symbol of her desolation, now felt different. The wind still whispered secrets, but now she listened with a more discerning ear. The hills that had once seemed to menace now felt like silent guardians. There was a harsh beauty here, yes, but also a profound sense of belonging, of having earned her place through trial and resilience. A few days later, Mrs. Henderson, emboldened by the news of Blackwood's sudden and mysterious departure, ventured out to their shed. She brought a basket laden with fresh bread, cheese, and a jar of precious apple preserves. Her face was wreathed in smiles, her relief palpable. "The town is breathing again, Ilara," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's like a dark cloud has lifted." She looked at Ilara with a new respect. "You endured. You both did." Ilara accepted the gifts with quiet gratitude. The path ahead was still uncertain. They would not rebuild the grand smithy in redemption, the town's earlier cowardice had left a bitter taste. Perhaps they would build something smaller, here on the edge of the wilderness, a place where their work would be honest and their spirit free. The connection with Cale and his people was an unspoken thread, a bond forged in crisis and sealed with mutual respect. She knew they were out there, watching, a silent, protective presence. It was not a promise of constant intervention, but an understanding that ran deeper than words, a shared knowledge of the land and the hard truths of survival. The embers of the fire that had destroyed her home still glowed in her memory, but now they were embers of a different kind, the embers of a forge fire ready to be fanned into a new flame, a new creation. Hope, quiet and resilient, had taken root in the ashes of despair. She picked up a piece of salvaged metal, its surface scarred and blackened, and felt its familiar weight in her hand. One day, she would find a way to heat it, to hammer it, to shape it into something new. The future was unwritten, but it would be forged with her own hands, imbued with the strength she had discovered within herself and the unexpected alliances that had helped her reclaim it.